Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the 11th Annual Graduate Student Colloquium sponsored by Penn's Department of Africana Studies. I am Olivia Kerr, a first-year PhD student in Africana Studies. But before we begin the formal introductions, I'd like to begin by thanking those in the department who have made this event possible on behalf of the entire Africana Studies Graduate Student Colloquium Planning Committee. Without the guiding assistance of Ms. Carol Davis, the Africana Studies Department Administrator, my fellow colleagues and I on the Planning Committee would be lost and without direction. So thank you, Ms. Carol. Ms. Audra Rogers, the Program Coordinator for the Center of Africana Studies, has been immensely helpful in logistical coordination for this colloquium. Thank you, Ms. Audra. Without the efforts of Mr. Tyrone Bullock Jr., you all in the audience and on Zoom would not know about this event. Tyrone has helped the committee with marketing, technological help and setup, and answering my chaotic emails. So thank you, Tyrone. Ms. Carol, Ms. Audra, and Tyrone, you all have helped the committee in ways that would not have resulted in the materialization of this exciting event. Many thanks to you all. To begin committee introductions, I will start with Rosie Poku, she, her, a second-year joint PhD student in Africana Studies and Comparative Literature. Rosie's research interests broadly lie in Black women's diasporic and transnational feminist writings of the early 20th century. She engages with Afro-diasporic texts written in Spanish, English, French, and Portuguese. Rosie has served as the head of the committee this year and has been an incredible, kind leader. Next, Sunit Kirane, she, her, third-year PhD student in Africana Studies, has been another colleague on the planning committee. Sunit's research interests sit at the nexus of feminist theory and Horn of Africa studies. Her dissertation project uses oral history as a method and conceptual frame to examine the mechanisms of gender, socialization, and definition in mid-20th century Eritrea. Another colleague, Mark Rigel, they, them, is a first-year PhD student in Africana Studies. They are academically interested in how Black LGBTQ+ communities within US cities experience life and organize against systemic violence and urban inequality. Mark will also serve as the moderator for this panel discussion. They will pose committee and audience questions. Finally, to close out committee introductions, just to reiterate, I'm Olivia Kerr, a first year here in the department. My research explores the contours of African American women's lives in the early to mid 20th century United States, and the tangible and epistemic manifestations of Blackness during the period, especially regarding African American women. Thank you to my fellow committee members. Planning this event with you all has included lively, intellectually stimulating conversations and shared creative insights. The committee has chosen Black Queer Placemaking, Methods, Histories, Diasporas as the 2024 Colloquium's topic due to our desire to incorporate various themes regarding Black lives on the African continent and in the African diaspora, and how these Black people navigate their specific geographies with their various identities. Selecting different methodological approaches regarding the research of speakers that have graciously agreed to participate in the colloquium lends itself to developing a more holistic and dynamic means of understanding how Black people of similar and different yet intersecting identities have and are creating their own spatial and epistemological spheres globally. Our scholars today are at different stages in their academic careers. The committee intentionally asked our scholars to join us today, regardless of their academic career standing, to provide a variety of academic and ideological orientations that enhance the diversity of the scholarly interventions that will be discussed today. To close out this introduction, I'd be remiss to not to formally introduce our wonderful and extremely brilliant scholars that have joined us here today. Dr. Paul Joseph López is a transdisciplinary Black Studies scholar whose research and teaching interests are at the intersections of Black Latin American / US Afro-Latinx social movements, Black queer feminist ethnographies and theories in the Americas, and transnational Black LGBTQ+ activism and political mobilizations. He is currently working on his book manuscript titled Indigenous Blackness, The Queer Politics of Self-Making Garifuna, New York. Is a critical ethnography that examines how gender and sexuality queerly shape the ways in which transgenerational Garifuna New Yorkers of Central American descent negotiate, articulate, and perform and contradict their multiple subjectivities as Black, Indigenous / Central American Caribbean people. Dr. López Oro is currently an assistant professor and director of the Africana Studies program at Bryn Mawr College. Next, Chrystel Oloukoï is an artist, film critic, and curator, broadly interested in experimental cinema, queer cinema, and Black continental and diasporic cinema. They hold a BA and MA in geography from the University Paris I, with concentrations in social anthropology, critical media practice, and women, gender, and sexuality. And they are a pre-doctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. Their dissertation titled Black Nocturnal, Ecologies of the Night in Lagos explores imaginations of the night in Lagos and the afterlives of colonial technologies of temporal discipline. Dr. J.T. Roane is an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Geography and Andrew W. Mellon Chair in Global Racial Justice in the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University, and he is a 2008 graduate of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. His book, titled Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place, was published in 2023 with the New York University Press. Roane's short experimental film, titled Plot, received support from Princeton's Crossroads Fellowship. He also currently serves as a member of Just Harvest, Tidewater, an Indigenous and Black-led organization building toward food sovereignty and justice in Virginia's historical plantation region through political and practical education. He is a 2023 and 2024 visiting scholar at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard. Speaking for myself and for my fellow committee members as well, we express immense gratitude to the scholars who are here today. I am confident that this intellectual discussion will be remarkably enriching. And to the Africana Studies staff, please know that your work and help in coordinating this event is cherished by the committee, and we are so grateful for you all. That all being said, it is time to begin the discussion. Thank you all for listening to my long spiel, but please join me in welcoming our scholars. Dr. López Oro, we invite you to begin this discussion.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes, Wikirabuño. I want to take a moment to recognize my presence on the lands, territories of indigenous nations of Lenape and those not recognized by the settler colonial state of Pennsylvania, to bear witness to the century-long legacies of survival and resistance of the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and throughout the Americas. My work could not be possible without a meditation on the impacts of settler colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, Black indigenous geographies of resistance, cimarronaje, and on the legacies of what M. Jackie Alexander calls crossings, or rather our continually overlapping histories of dispossession. I want to first shout out Rosie for the wonderful invitation. Just to share a brief anecdote, I had the honor and pleasure of being Rosie's professor of Africana Studies at Smith College during my first year on the tenure track. I can't overemphasize how beautiful it is to have like a full circle moment to be in your company and for the wonderful invitation to be in Africana Studies with you all today. So thank you so much. I'm also incredibly grateful for our Carter G. Woodson legacy here and community. I think part of what I would love for us to have in the Q&A is to also think about Black queer placemaking, Black queer studies, also as the practice in the academy. JT has been in my life literally since my second or third year in the PhD program at Northwestern, where I began my doctoral work in African American Studies. And he's been a beacon of support and guidance, right? And I think part of Black queer kinship that I'm going to talk about today is like those incredibly important, intimate relationships of kinship that transcend any biological reminiscences of what we understand to be home and family. So I just wanted to start from a place of Black queer gratitude. So thank you, thank you, thank you. It's an honor and complete pleasure to share a little bit of the wonderings. I'm kind of in this manuscript revision hell part of the book. So I'm still thinking alongside Omishik and Natasha Tinsley for this chapter, Jafari Allen, and his understandings of Audre Lorde's queer kinship building. I'm gonna spend time in Garifuna dance spaces. I always want to say like I'm not a dance scholar, but I'm interested in how Black movement really symbolizes and creates a certain kind of embodied archive. So I'll talk a bit about that chapter. Garinagu or Garifuna, as we are properly known, are Black indigenous peoples whose ethnogenesis begins as descendants of shipwrecked enslaved West Africans and Carib Arawak indigenous peoples on the Lesser Antillean island of St. Vincent. Garifuna Marunaj and resistance to enslavement and European colonialism marked their exile by British colonial powers in 1797 to the Bay Island of Honduras, Roatan, and subsequent migrations to mainland Central America's Caribbean coast of Belize, Guatemala, mainland Honduras, and Nicaragua prior to the formations of those republics. A silent history of Black indigeneity in the political and military formation of Central American nation states. I often pause here to overemphasize the way that generational anti-Blackness works within Latin America, is that Blackness, particularly in Central America, is ascribed as foreign, right? Is ascribed as happening after the formation of the nation state. So this is kind of the 1619 project moment hemispherically, right? Where Black and indigenous folks are also calling to task a nation states that negates their existence and experiences and then lived building parts of the nation, right? And I overemphasize that part because I think sometimes we tend to romanticize what's happening in Black Latin America, and this racial project of mestizaje continues, right, to kind of really queer our understandings of Black Latin America. And I spend time in my work really thinking about Jim Crow and mestizaje hand in hand, right? What does it mean to not necessarily have to be, right, with Jim Crow signage, but you're in a Jim Crow state, right? So you don't need a sign saying no Black folks allowed in certain spaces in Latin America, right? It's just built into the structure of Latin American racial politics. So in Indigenous Blackness, the queer politics of self-making at Garifuna New York, I'm thinking transdisciplinary on how Garifuna New Yorkers of Central American descent negotiate, perform, and articulate their multiple subjectivities at the intersections of their Blackness and indigeneity, and what they often reject as Afro-Latinidad. And I'm happy to talk about that rejection during the Q&A, because I think it's an interesting moment politically and socially around how does this Spanish-speaking Black indigenous community reject a term that seems to be embraced by mainstream, right, Latinxs of African descent. New York City is home to the largest Garifuna community outside of Central America, which marks for a number of reasons. One of them pointing to the long histories of US imperialism on Central America's Caribbean coast vis-a-vis the United Fruit Company, whose financial base were in Manhattan and New Orleans, another significant geography for Black Central Americans in the United States. And Glenn Chambers does this beautiful monograph on the long histories of Black Central Americans in New Orleans and what scholars of New Orleans during this time period are thinking as an extension of the Banana Republic. I turn to multi-sided archives of performances, oral history, social media, film, documentaries, and print materials to piece together an often overlooked history of Black indigeneity in New York City. My subject position as a third-generation Brooklynite of Garifuna Honduran descent, born and raised on the nostalgia of my immigrant grandparents, parents, and siblings, who returned me to the ancestral territories of El Triunfo de la Cruz, La Ceiba, and Dangriga. Enough to settle a little Garifuna under my Spanglish tongue. Informs my political and theoretical commitments to thinking and writing about Black indigeneity within a broader scope of the Americas, with careful attention to local and regional nuances, but always understanding Blackness and indigeneity to transcend geo-colonial hegemonic constructions of borders. To borrow from the work of Richard Eiton, my framing of diaspora as an anaformative impulse, putting all spaces into play with each other, dismantling and hopefully transcending nationalism, or to echo the words of Black queer diasporic theorist Ronaldo Walcott, urgently calling for Black queer diasporic reading of dismantling this nation state thing. Standing on the theoretical and genealogical shoulders of Black queer feminist theorists such as M. Jackie Alexander, Audre Lorde, Jafari Allen, and Omashike Natasha Tinsley, my queer reading of Garifuna throughout my book project centers a twofold praxis of resistance. As Tinsley writes in her trailblazing journal article, Black Atlantic, Queer Atlantic, quote, queer not in the sense of a gay or same-sex loving identity waiting to be excavated from the ocean floor, but as a praxis of resistance. Queer in the sense of marking disruption to the violence of normative order, and powerfully so. Connecting in ways that commodify flesh was never supposed to, loving your own kind when your kind was supposed to cease to exist, forging interpersonal connections that counteract imperial desires for Africans living death. Omashike Natasha Tinsley breaks path to help us rethink, reimagine how the Black Atlantic has always been the queer Atlantic, how the relationship between queerness and Blackness is always in the praxis of resistance to white supremacy, hegemony, commodifications, and borders. My queer reading of Garifuna folks here and beyond is one that centers the silences and erasures of the political and cultural labor that LGBTQ plus identified Garifuna peoples are at the forefront of political movements of preserving Garifuna culture, language, and history. So this particular image, I spend a lot of time in the first chapter in the book really unpacking the queerness of this image. This is in Orchard Beach. This is not in Central America's Caribbean coast. This is another part of the Black Atlantic, right? So thinking about not only bodies of water and using bodies of water for conjuring ancestral memory, but thinking about the public, right? The public queering of what it means to be Black Indigenous in Orchard Beach, in the Bronx, right? What does it mean to bring ancestors spiritually through possession, through song, through oral traditions, right? So part of what I'm thinking in this image is also how are Garifuna folks queerly making ancestral land? Because part of the larger scope of the book project, Indigenous Blackness, is I'm basically begging the question of what would it mean if we were to deeply understand that the descendants of people of African descent who survived the Middle Passage are indigenous to the Americas, right? How do we understand the indigeneity of Blackness in the Americas? And part of my question is using Garifuna folks, right, who understand their Blackness and indigeneity to happen in the same breath, right? It's not a compartmentalization, it's not a hyphen, right? It's not a hashtag, it's not, right? There's something about the indigenous Blackness of Garifuna folks and land, right? That it's that's helping me to clear my understanding of indigeneity and Blackness, right? But also in particular, what I'm trying to also displace is also the stubbornness of it, right? Part of what, and I spend a lot of time talking to my students about this. So give me a moment when they get into like this pedagogical mode, right? Because part of what Garifuna folks model for us in the Americas, as well as the Gullah and the Quiche, as well as the Maroons in Jamaica, as well as the Palenques in Colombia, the Quilombos in Brazil, is that land cannot be the only signifier of indigeneity. And this is where I turn to Toni Morrison's work in Beloved, and not necessarily as a literary scholar, but I'm actually fascinated with this 1987 interview, or 89, let me go back to that, interview that she's having about Beloved, where she spends 10 minutes unpacking how she wrote Beloved and the haunting of ancestral memory, right? And she begs us to say, we can still communicate to our ancestors, bring them to the table, right? And part of her writing process in Beloved was the haunting of her ancestors, right? It was the haunting of an archival ancestor from a newspaper headline clip. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the ancestrality of indigenous Blackness, right? And part of that is I want to disrupt this idea of land, right? Because land can't part of what land does is it forecloses the possibility of seeing Black people in the Americas, right, as indigenous, right? And I often spend time, and this is where I have an interesting conversation around Orlando Patterson's work, right, in social death, is to also think about what does chattel slavery foreclose Black folks and its relationship to land, and how indigenous people, particularly in Latin America, right? And this is the part where Latin American mestizaje is incredibly anti-Black. Part of how Latin American nation states construct their national imaginary is through romanticizing its indigenous heritage by negating its Black heritage, right? So even in places like Brazil, that has the largest Black Brazilian population, right? Evento Frieri, right? Thinking about miscegenation. Part of what that project does is that it folkloralizes African culture, right? Instead of politicizing it, and leaves that work for politicizing Black culture on the hands of Black folks, right? While the nation state gets to folklorize, right? I'll unpack that a little bit later, right? It's a complicated project, but part of it is like, I want to always emphasize the anti-Blackness of it, right? Because part of where we still are in terms of our intellectual understandings of Black Latin America is that mestizaje is still romanticized, right? There's something about Afro-Latinidad and its idea of racial mixture that gets romanticized, right? Instead of interrogating Blackness and centering Blackness. Sorry, just wanted to kind of contextualize that real quick. So let me spend some time with this chapter real quick. Most of the time, I feel like I need to explain Black Central America, so let me do that real quick, and then we can, and I should have got that slide up, right? Okay, so just really quickly before turning a little bit more to the Garif and the Dance Company archive that I'm working through, I want to situate the histories of anti-Black racism on Central America's Caribbean coast, paying close attention to the ways in which those histories and present-day realities shape how Garifan and New Yorkers in diaspora and on the isthmus politically mobilized to preserve and restore their culture, language, and history in the face of mestizo multiculturalism. So in the United States, the invocation of Central America conjures a set of racial and political imaginaries that center mestizos, indigenous cultures, revolutionary movements, civil wars, and US occupations that at times eclipse a discussion of race and racism in the region and its diaspora. In Central America, race and racism is obscured by the ghost of mestizaje as an imagined racial mixture, birthing a mythical racial sameness bounded by nationalism. Within Central American mestizaje, Blackness is relegated, alienated, and ascribed to the Caribbean coast, erasing centuries of Black folks in the interior and Pacific coast. So let me pause real quick right there and just show this map, particularly because in Central America, right, which is really different from the rest of like Mexico, the Caribbean, South America, not just geographically, but where it's located, the way Blackness is ascribed by the nation state, it comes from elsewhere, right? It's not in the interior, right? So in the interior of Central America is the bed of Spanish colonialism, right? This is the mestizo governance, right? So there are mestizo folks in the center of Central America that have never met Black Central Americans, right? Because nationally, in the national imaginary of Central American nation states, Blackness is ascribed only to the Caribbean coast. So this is when you see TikToks and Twitter and social media saying, well, El Salvador also has Black people, right? But it doesn't have a Caribbean coast. Well, in fact, Salvador actually has a ton of Black folks because it has a Black Pacific, right? So part of that history gets entirely erased, right? So there's an interesting conundrum in Central America where the Black Atlantic and the Black Pacific are not necessarily in conversation with one another. And it actually lets mestizo governance of anti-Blackness centralize their power in the interior of the country, while displacing Black and indigenous folks to the coasts, right? Removing them from power, right? Especially political. By ascribing Blackness and Black people to Central America's Caribbean coast, mestizaje constructs its imaginary in opposition to and in negation of Blackness, especially when the Caribbean coast is understood to be removed from the national public spaces of mestizo governance, i.e. Managua or Tegucigalpa. Moreover, it renders and ascribes Central American Blackness as Caribbean, coming from elsewhere and not already always present prior to the formation of the Republic. More recently, Central American neoliberal multiculturalism constructs Blackness as a folkloric caricature for tourist and popular culture consumption. Therefore, Black Central Americans doubly negotiate their invisibilities on the isthmus and their diasporas in the United States. Despite the extensive and rich history of Africans and their descendants in the isthmus, especially their presence and contribution centuries prior to the 1821 Wars of Independence, Black history and Blackness remains alien to Central American nationhood. This negation and erasure of Blackness is produced and preserved by the dominant national racial project of mestizaje. Black Central Americans transgenerationally migrate to the United States with centuries of embodied histories of anti-Black racism and violence. My reference to violence here is one both physical and epistemological, pointing to the centuries of land dispossession, US imperialism, and erasure from national subjecthood. These histories shape the ways in which Garifuna folks negotiate, perform, and articulate their Black Latinidad in the United States. So let me turn to the particular chapter that I am still very much working through and happy to kind of share a bit of its beginnings with you all. I want to talk about Garifuna dance collectives, in particular. And I want to introduce you to Chonita. Garifuna dance collectors and companies have a long and nuanced hemispheric history of creating subaltern spaces for Garifuna youth to transcend the politics of cultural preservation. Garifuna dance collectors emerged throughout Central America's Caribbean coast at the tail end of the first wave of multicultural constitutional reforms, which were spearheaded by Nicaragua in 1987. Nicaragua's Creole, Garifuna indigenous communities modeled to the rest of Latin America what collective rights for Afro-descendant and indigenous people could look like, both legislatively and culturally, in spaces where Black folks are marginalized and imagined outside of mestizo nationalism. This, quote, win by Nicaragua's Caribbean coast communities directly reshaped the ways in which Black Central Americans mobilize politically within the cultural sphere. So as you can see, Chonita, who's on the right, she's part of this generation of Garifuna dance companies, curators, and organizers at the height of neoliberal multiculturalism in Central America, where Garifuna culture is taken particularly as part of the Constitution, right? So one thing that's incredibly violent about this time period in Central America's Caribbean coast is that the nation state not only finally acknowledges the presence of Black and indigenous people, but it takes Black indigenous culture and literally robs Black indigenous people of land, right? So this is the ongoing battle, particularly for Garifuna and Creole communities on Central America's Caribbean coast, is that their culture is co-opted, it's appropriated by the mestizo nation state, right? You only see Black folks on anything nationally, ascribed during the World Cup, right? These particular international movements, right? Yet their land is still being extracted, right? And Black and indigenous folks are constantly being displaced and dispossessed, and literally part of the migrations to the US, right? So when we're seeing CNN, when we're seeing MSNBC, and we're seeing the Central America crisis, those are predominantly Black and indigenous folks, right? Even though they're not registered in CNN, right? You don't see the Black indigenous folks crossing, right? But part of how we also racially understand Central Americans in the US is part of that narrative too. So I spent time with Chonita, in other words, to think about the following. So in other words, it was immediately after 1987 that the first ever Garifuna dance company, the Ballet Nacional Folclórico Garifuna, was formally established in Honduras in one of the most unexpected locations, the very mestizo capital of Tegucigalpa. In Central America, the shift in racial discourse from mestizaje to multiculturalism brands Black and indigenous cultural expressions of embodied ancestral knowledge as commodified objects, governance and consumption that falsely portends inclusion into a project we were never meant to be a part of. Yet these dance collectives and companies nurture a space for transgenerational exchanges, performance of cultural preservation, and engage a hemispheric project of Black and indigeneity as an embodied archive imprinted onto the flesh of Black dancing bodies, where queerness and queer subjectivities find a home within a home, where queer freedoms are manifested to the stage and to the bodies of those witnessing and enacting the performance. So I'm gonna start closing up a bit and I'll spend a bit of time thinking along this particular moment with Chonita and wanting to unpack a bit of the gender politics around the dance company and the queer making of that dance company. So I'll start with this notion within Black queer studies in the context of the Caribbean, el secreto abierto, the open secret. And part of the notion of open secret is really useful to think about how LGBTQ Garinagu sexualities are expressed and lived within the matrilineal heteronormative boundaries of Garifunanes. So part of what I'm thinking through in this particular dance company is that Chonita, who is a Garifuna lesbian dancer, leaves Honduras in the late 80s. And one of the things about migrations of Black Latin Americans to the US is that it's often due to the anti-Blackness of the region, but it's also due to particularly around gendered politics, right? So she has to leave Honduras, not only because of its anti-Black racism, but its incredibly perpetual homophobic culture that's embedded in machismo, right? So part of what she does in her migration to New York is to find a home in New York where her male gender presentation as a Garifuna lesbian woman is opened and allowed for her to be expressed, right? So part of her journey is to also want to create these Garifuna dance companies to build community with other LGBTQ Garifuna youth. So first of all, one of the things about this that's really transformative and really important is that there's a gendered politics within Garifuna culture around ancestral memory. So part of what Garifuna dance does a lot is that Garifuna dance is understood for a couple of things. Garifuna dance is understood as Garifuna women are the only ones that can do it, right? So there's a gender politics around dance. And then when men enter into those spaces, there's also an assumption and an ascription of queerness on those bodies, right? Part of what Chonita does is that she really disrupts that heteronormative gender construction around Garifuna dance, where she flips it, right? She actually has the Garifuna young women drumming, and then she'll have the Garifuna young men dancing, right? And this actually becomes deeply powerful in many ways, right? So part of what she strategically does in those Garifuna queer spaces is to allow for a fluidity around gender expressions, but also fluidity around sexual identities, right? So I talk a little bit about in this chapter, el secreto abierto, right? This open secret within Garifuna communities around gendered and sexual politics of queerness, right? Part of it has a lot to do with if motherhood and fatherhood finds a form of completion, then a queer sexual identity is acceptable. Once fatherhood and motherhood happens, right? Once you become this role within a Garifuna community, the questioning, the challenging, the wonderings, the probing, the whispers, right? Change and shift, right? Yet there's a certain kind of way that matrilineal Garifuna culture allows for the secret to be openly safe, if that makes any sense, right? So in particular ways, this is a safe space that Chonita has created in her diasporic migrations to really want to foster a certain kind of queer kinship of gender expression. In many ways, I spend a lot of time thinking about these spaces and aligning them to a long history of ball culture in New York City, right? And thinking particularly because a lot of these spaces actually end up not only being in the physical subarctic geographies of a basement, of a church basement, of an old abandoned fire department, right? But part of what the subaltern aspect of these queer Garifuna dance companies do is that they're hidden in plain sight, right? They're practicing at Medgar Evers College, right? They're performing at the Chamber, right? They're at the Botanica on 116th and Lexington, right? The part of those queer dance companies is that there's nothing necessarily hidden by the queerness. So that's what I have to offer today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
It's going to be hard to follow a little bit. I'm going to try, and I don't have as much of a pretty PowerPoint behind me. Thank you for inviting me for this event, and I'm really excited to share space with all of you. And thank you especially to Mark, Olivia, and Rose for facilitating my stay here. I'm going to present a paper tentatively entitled Our Fathers Had No House on Queer Nightlife, Habitation, and the Politics of Shared Exposure. And the Father's House is a reference to Appiah's in my Father's House. And it's based on dissertation materials, like my latest chapter, which are primarily a reflection of the EndSARS protest that happened in Nigeria in October 2020, and the kinds of coalitional politics that emerged from those protests, alongside a shared experience of criminalization and police brutality. So early on a Tuesday afternoon, I ventured with my friend Bimbola to Night Out, a rave-adjacent gathering organized in one of our regular hangouts in Lagos Island, situated in an unfinished, nondescript 5-story building with a rooftop, tucked in between a disused gas station and a bank. The medium-sized room we occupy in this bare cement walls tower feels like a microcosm, severed from the outside. Inside, the tower windows are darkened by thick black curtains held in place by strong tape. I've missed the first edition of Night Out. This is the second edition, and the theme is Enchanted Forest. Artificial vines and grass cover the floor and hang from the wall and ceiling, creating a very trippy atmosphere. I quickly lose Bimbola to a flurry of friends I haven't seen in a while. They live far in the northern periphery of the city towards Shagamu, and they rarely came down to the islands where the majority of those events take place. So the geography of Lagos is kind of divided by the lagoon between the islands, which are the historical and economic center of the city, very private areas towards which everything gravitates, and where many aspire to live, and the mainland, which is a more mixed income area of the city. As a masked lesbian, Bimbola's marginal geographical location at the northern edge of the city, which has much to do with class too, also speaks to a tacit spatial division between a queer and trans nightlife in commercial entertainment spaces on the island, with exceptions, and more isolated queer, mostly lesbian hangouts, often in residential locations on the mainland or even further in the suburbs. I need a bit of water. So depending on the type of activity involved, a rave night, a more laid-back bar, a lounge atmosphere, a film party, a ballroom, a quieter social gathering, one can easily predict where it's likely to happen. The nature of those events is coded in the language they are promoted in, the pre-screening of attendees, and the reluctant delayed disclosure of location, in a context of exacerbation of state-sanctioned homophobia, with a number of arrests, prosecutions, oftentimes targeting queer nightlife. In Nigeria, this culminates with the 2013 SSMPA Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act, and recently in Ghana, as you've probably heard, the passage of yet another anti-LGBTQ+ law. In spite of all of those precautions, queer nightlife in Lagos is also in high demand as a kind of fetish experience that expats, tourists, and well-off straight nocturnal revelers love to partake in, eager to intoxicate themselves to the ecstasy of queer joy without partaking into any of the risks and struggles. So I just heard my friend Fola from across the room. In a lush green cutout dress, blood red boots, and skin constellated with glitter, she looks straight out of a magazine cover page. Fola, who jokingly refers to herself as a nightlife butterfly, used to organize many of the ballroom parties in Lagos. This Monday, March 18th, would have been her 30th birthday. At some point, Fola and myself come out for some fresh air on the rooftop. We are blinded by the light of the afternoon sun. This is a very different experience from nocturnal events in the same building, where we escape the stuffiness of the dark room into the night breeze. Here, walking aesthetically in the light, what dominates is a sense of out-of-timeliness, discordance with social rhythms, which was the stated purpose of this odd afternoon rave party anyways. And one of the organizers I had interviewed prior states, there is no night and day. We wanted to shake all of the scripts about where, when, and why one should be allowed to party. Paula shared much later in what ended up being our last conversation a few days before her passing. Regular clubs, I hate them. It's very rigid, everyone's just there, just trying to look cool, popping up bottles, playing a role. It's a stage, they are not really having fun. This is an accurate depiction of places such as W Bar, Club Cubana, Vertigo, Velvet, etc. Nightlife is often a continuation of work, not only in Adorno's reflection on the function of leisure as controlled excess to canalize the energies of workers, but also as a site to create connections, extract resources and contacts, or more simply find shelter against commute. In a social nocturnal world built on hierarchy, and here I'm quoting Paula again, literally Lagos is built on classism and elitism, queer nightlife sits awkwardly. The raves, she says, there is no hierarchy, no differentiation, no people on the floor versus people sitting at tables. At the raves, we're all standing and dancing and having fun. In fact, there are no seats to sit down. You're just there for one purpose, which is to dance. It is true that queerness as the basis of association creates odd bedfellows. An event such as Enchanted Forest brings together incredibly famous and well-off individuals who one would rarely be in the same room with otherwise, as well as working class queers. Such proximities are not within frictions. Odd bedfellows are the theme of this talk, a speculative exercise to imagine the kind of solidarities that emerge from the repression queer revelers and night workers of very different walks of life in general face in Lagos. And night workers is a term I'm grappling with the dissertation that's coming from a set of medieval England laws that are traced to the kind of formation of police forces historically in Europe, which is a set of laws that criminalize people's presence at night outside the bounds of their lodgings. And I'm trying to think about the criminalization of various kinds of people who just find themselves outside on the streets in Lagos at night under that rubric of the night worker, and the afterlives of that set of laws via British colonialism. After all, it is no accident that many of the state sanctions arrest and abuse queer people face in Lagos happen in the context of nighttime. My dissertation project grapples with the colonial origins and afterlives of a singular obsession with the night in mechanisms of punishment and repression in Lagos, whereby disciplining the night became intrinsic to the forms of sovereignty deployed by the state. So for the purpose of this talk, I want to sit with the idea of odd bedfellows, gesturing at the ways in which mechanisms of control bring together queer revelers and a larger array of night workers. Bimbola and I decided to leave around 3 p.m. to avoid the bottomless traffic which paralyzes the city during the week from 4 p.m. into late in the night. As we drive away, Bimbola notes how strange it is to be on the side of traffic. Instead of leaving a party early enough to beat out traffic, they instead often find themselves attending parties or waiting in sites of nocturnal entertainment to circumvent traffic. Part of the night workers this talk brings in uneasy juxtaposition with queer revelers and of the army of commuters whose sense of nightlife is structured by various amount of time spent waiting in bars, clubs, hotels, and other sites of nocturnal entertainment. And those sites are, in popular parlance, gathered under the rubric of kilo traffic bars, so I would refer to them as such. These are sites where urban residents try to avoid traffic, subverting sites of nocturnal entertainment into functional proxy homes or temporary shelters. Kilo traffic bars are but one element of a constellation of migratory sleeping places for low and middle income urban workers during a given week. From the occasional night in parked vehicles, shared renting rooms, bedholds, friends or partners' houses. So Bimbola's nocturnal experiences stretch between scenes of queer nightlife and what I define here as kilo traffic bars. They work in Ikeja in the center of the mainland, a walking distance from where I live, but live further north in the suburbs, where they bought a house with their partner. And the irony of the location of that house is that it is within one of the multiple real estate projects associated with a corporate megachurch Redeemed Church of God for the purpose of creating a self-sufficient private city. It is a fantasy of religious totalitarianism, a city of God right at the periphery of the city of sin that Lagos is supposed to be. They don't know the gates they shout about are within the gates, Bibola often jokes. These isolated real estate developments by churches can end up being havens for socially marginalized people by providing a sense of distance from neighbors and privacy rarely granted within the more densely populated areas of the city. This is another case of odd bedfellows of queer camouflage, making life and community in the interstices of central but abandoned or nondescript buildings, or farther away in isolated suburbs. 2/3 of the estate they live in is unoccupied, and that's part of the appeal. Similar to finance capital-driven real estate developments elsewhere, a number of plots haven't been bought yet, and occupancy rates are quite low. The loud night prayer sessions of the Redemption Camp's new auditorium nearby, who has a seating capacity for over 100,000 attendees, and it's quite scary when there's actually a night vigil happening here because it's a huge number of people in the same place, and it's a very specific soundscape. The presence of that camp is the only inconvenience, as they have very few neighbors in that area, and neighbors usually mind their own business. So with housing prices within Lagos, out of which for many, peripheral residential developments northeast, north, and westward the lagoon have become more attractive in spite of the distance. When they finish the construction of the road, I'll technically be a 30-minute drive away from Ikeja, jokes Bimbola. But with the bad state of the road interrupted by construction-related diversions, as well as the usual traffic, it often ends up being closer to 3 hours, if not more. So 3 hours is a commute, Bimbola's commute between Ikeja and the northern suburbs. And it's not like some people would spend 4, 5, 6 hours in traffic every day. So it's not even the longest possible. You've been talking about the fall for the past 4 years, I guess. I know we'll both be dead before it materializes, replies Bimbola. At one of the lesbian sleepovers often held at Bimbola's house, we end up sharing rambunctious tales of nights out in the city. Bimbola's partner, just staring at us, drinking games, playing on the couch, suddenly says, "That's the extent of nightlife for me. What you guys do over there is too hectic." And by over there, she means in the central areas of Lagos. "It's not that exciting on the regular," says Bimbola. "In truth, it's mostly about killing traffic." This response crystallizes the discrepancy between narration and lived experience. The night owls in the room narrate our nocturnal adventures precisely as adventures, plots with characters, a beginning and an end, as well as a general sense of excitement. For sure, we have a truckload of thrilling stories. Yet in our quotidian, nightlife plays out primarily in a stretched out, nondescript temporal mode of waiting out traffic. For commuters in varying state of exhaustion, nocturnal sites of entertainment are inhabited as a kind of refuge. So my object of research often provokes contrasted response, from excitement to puzzlement. One clear line of demarcation is between people who only occasionally partake in Lagos nightlife and those who belong to the large segment of commuters across social class whose every night lives rely on a indiscriminate amount of time spent in the city's nocturnal economy. Because I'm interested in taking together nighttime as a category of life, my ethnographic focus throughout my fieldwork, out of interest, but also out of my geographical location on the mainland, has been on the second group. Even if my social location as a participant and sometimes organizer of queer nightlife has productively kept me at the intersection of both. I am fascinated by the ambivalence of nightlife as a site of promise, excess, and joy, as well as burden, continuation of labor, one never totally escapes. In both queer nightlife and commuter nightlife, the night emerges as the answer to an exorbitant demand, that of regenerating bodies and souls in a context of manifold and interconnected forms of alienation, at work, at home, and in between. Whether in queer underground parties or in heliotropic bars, a similar sense of being able to rekindle with precious parts of oneself only at night, or at least attempting to, emerges. So Bimbola, like many commuters, can spend from a couple of days to a couple of weeks away from home at any given time. They will either sleep in a rented room in Ogba, which is closer to Ikeja, on the mainland still, or occasionally spend the night at my place or at another friend's place or at a sex partner's place. Yet they invariably end up spending a large part of their evening and night in one of the heliotropic bars along the Allen-Opeli axis in Ikeja. One of those main bars is Pekas, which opens on a large courtyard divided in a front yard and a backyard by a massive projection billboard, which doubles also as a projection screen and a kind of privacy partition between those two areas. It is in that typically less animated backyard that commuters settle on the ubiquitous white plastic tables and chairs advertising the Nigerian brewery Star Beer. As long as one buys at least one beverage, one could stay until closing time in the early hours of the morning. Geographies of sleep thus emerge as night walks sway from nocturnal establishment to others, artfully exploiting the differentials in closing hours. One of my interlocutors, Victor, a construction worker in his 30s, which frequently spends his evenings and sometimes night at Vegas, said something in one of our encounters that remains up with me. I'd rather be here than sitting at home in the dark. Sitting at home in the dark is as much a literal reference to the vagaries of electricity distribution, especially wireless between Lagos and Oloukoï, but also a metaphor for a profound sense of alienation with normative domestic spaces, and a set of social and familial demands increasingly difficult to do. Some nights there's a live band or dancing performance, but most nights the manager just blasts an Afrobeat playlist, full of loud velodromes and insistent soundscape of a nightlife that refuses foreclosure. This is like therapy, shares Bimbola. Going home directly, they continue, I feel restless. By home here, the telling me means a rented room in Ogba, not a house in the suburbs. This reminds me of what Ayubani, who works at the mechanic shop down my building, also shared. Quote, in the evenings, it's like I'm feeling too much, so I just go there to relax, unquote. Feeling restless or feeling too much, a term to describe a predicament inextricably physical and spiritual. As a nightly ritual across the city, in the loud atmosphere drowning discussions and thoughts alike, one can surrender to noise, the impromptu moves that usually steals out of bodies, and the occasional reminder of aliveness from a sip of a chilled mortuary standard water. Nothing much happens in heliotropic bars. They stand in sharp contrast with the fetish-like status of queer nightlife. As one element of a larger nexus of interconnected and proliferating proxy homes at night, they attest to how precarious lives are made in and through night spaces, in the shadow of long histories of casualization of labor. Heliotropic bars express the capacity of nighttime to disorganize social time, to disrupt narrative, and the very idea of the plot. The lack of happening, perhaps, sometimes is the point, the reprieve from the tyranny of narratives, not thinking too much, not feeling restless, letting go. Returning to Night Out, with which I opened this talk, the contrast between a specifically queer form of nightlife, playfully disarticulated from a working day around which commuter nightlife is in contrast articulated, is only apparent. If the latter is imagined as bringing the day to a close, by way of dramatizing the moment of transition or closure itself, the other makes a mockery of it and its fantasy of social reproduction. In both cases, however, the very idea of a working day is ultimately undermined. Whether in queer underground parties or in heliotropic bars, the frenzy with which one attempts to rekindle with precious parts of oneself at night gestures at the shapeless contours of work in a newly rural present. So the ghost of the figure of the migrant worker reinscribes heliotropic bars within very specific colonial urban afterlives. And to go very fast here, historically, colonial cities needed workers, but refused to see Black Africans as anything else than temporary sojourners in town. In the case of Lagos, this leads to structural externalization of functions of social reproduction into the nocturnal economy. A lot of workers, housing, for instance, in colonial Lagos did not even have kitchens or like the kind of areas you would need in a house to actually become home and live there. So the nocturnal economy becomes one of these central arena of life and social reproduction. An early 1940s editorial of the West African Pilots, which was one of the main newspapers at the time, laments that in Lagos, most residential homes had been converted into pubs, and that each street had at least one pub in a classic genre of Mawr pamphlet, which takes the night as a site which brings whose assumed obsessive nature brings about specters of delayed, suspended, or compromised futures. I read this pamphlet as a kind of manifestation of a desire for straight time. That is, an ordered progressive timescape. Instead of homes turned into taverns, key traffic bars, which have proliferated in the contemporary landscape of the city, as well as the nondescript sites of nocturnal queer revelry for those whose homes could never accommodate the expense of their being, testify instead to taverns turned into homes, to the extent to which nightlife, both to the commuter and to the queer reveler, produces otherwise forms of inhabitation and claims to the city. So if I insist to think alongside a kind of majoritarian nightlife with traffic bars and a minoritarian nightlife such as queer nightlife, it is precisely to underscore that the fantasy of housebound habitation on nuclear domestic terms that hegemonic homophobic discourse mobilizes in a West African context to colonize queer sociality and nightlife in general is precisely that, a fantasy, a smoke dream. I'm highlighting here reasons that are connected with the specific political economy of a post-colonial neoliberal city such as Lagos, but it is as much about a gendered patriarchal escape from the burden of social reproduction in the home as well. What does it mean to be criminalized to salvage a dream of domesticity that was never attainable in the first place, in addition to not necessarily being desirable? What does it mean to die for a fantasy? What connections might emerge from the collective disenchantment with that fantasy? Traffic bars are but one symptomatic example of a profound alienation between urban residents and the home, of a fragmented sense of inhabitation. The stakes of denouncing such fantasy are more pressing than ever. The father's house that queer sociality is supposed to threaten had no walls and was already crumbling and leaking of all parts in the first place. This is why so many have to construct homes out of sight of nocturnal encampments, queer and straight people alike. The nocturnal scene of the traffic bar, without clear temporal boundaries, no beginning or end in sight, can thus be understood as one of the many subaltern strategies in face of the dissolution of presumably stable signifiers of work and housing. And I want to mark here that those were never stable in the first place in contexts marked by the afterlives of slavery. As a form of temporal waywardness, these forms of nocturnal inhabitation disrupt the idea of nightlife as contained excess within functionalist imaginations of social reproduction. Here, I want to juxtapose Bimbola's commuting nocturnal nomadism, which they and myself understand as a kind of time enabled by the open nature of their relationship with their partner outside of straight norms of domesticity, with the lives of many commuters in a neoliberal economy and treating Bimbola themselves, which demands endless flexibility at odds with the need of a productive worker attached to a singular house. Taking together Bimbola's sexual identity and labor situation to reflect on that of commuters of various sexual identification of a shared labor condition, I am to trouble both a hegemonic straight imagination of the domestic and a mainstream queer contestation of it, as antithetical, but sometimes conjoined at the edge. At stake is the fact that the dominant normativity which takes a home as anchor often fails to cohere in actuality for many, even those who find comfort and moral certitude in those norms. While on the other hand, the seductions of fetishization, of perpetual movement and non-fixity as inherent sites of subversion internationally too often leaves unaddressed how these are no less antithetical to the demands of capital. This is an argument that Black studies and specifically Black queer studies have made for a long time, specifically in relation to the fungibility of enslaved. Here, I want to foreground Cathy Cohen's essential question, who, we might ask, is truly on the outside of heteronormative power, maybe most of us. On the other side of the norm is the fact that most of us are thrown willingly or not in deeply non-normative lives. Queer times then points at the opportunities produced out of the very disjuncture between the material temporal disorientations and disorganization inherent to capitalist processes of extraction, and on the other hand, the cultivation of aspirations towards the norm, towards an imagined endpoint of success in regulated, organized temporal life. Queer temporalities then are not outside of, but fully embedded within the violent regimes of imperial time. As markers of refused or denied heteronormative structures of closing time, nights spent in proxy homes highlight the messy gaps where complicity and alliances can emerge. Proxy homes point to the ways in which hegemonic norms fail all the time, as well as to points of potential rearticulation of the politics of solidarity, of shared homelessness, vulnerability, and abjection from straight time. So in June 2021, I participated on a panel on capitalism and classism as part of an event organized by the Oasis Project organization in Lagos by my friend Matthew Blaise. And the larger theme of that gathering was where are we now and where are we going? An examination of the queer movement in Nigeria. There were a little under 100 attendees at this event, most of them friendly or at least familiar faces from kindred organizations. Aside from organizational life, we were connected by an intimate knowledge of each other, developed night after night in a palimpsest of raves, hangouts, night outs, and balls, which formed the basis of a connective tissue made of sweat, stories, intoxication, and joy. We were in many ways kin, with all the dysfunctions of the family form. Nights spent together, partying, but also supporting each other against the night-watch state, formed the subterranean terrain of our bonds, of our sense of community, and ultimately of our organizational capacity. So after the panels, which were late in the afternoon, there was a party until the early hours of the morning. That night, I left early with Oloukoï, which I had met via the area scatter their relief fund for arrested queer protesters during the NSAS protest. She knew I lived on the mainland, not far from Cement, where someone from the mutual aid structure had been arrested in a raid and needed to be bailed out. So she was part of a small mutual aid structure with 4 other trans sex workers, in which the cost of bail was shared equally amongst all, each time one of them got arrested. This was a form of mutualization of risk, often familiar at different scales within queer trans and sex work organizations, characterized by non-separability. Who the criminalizing arm of the state targeted at this specific moment mattered less than the knowledge of an equally shared possibility that it could fail on anyone at any given moment. This was the politics of solidarity in which the question of innocence was less central than that of collective exposure, and thus necessarily collective remediation. Public paradigms are a common ritual of humiliation for arrested night workers. So dozens of people were sitting on the floor, lying in front of the Oloukoï police station in Cement, similarly arrested during a nocturnal task force raid, which are aired to defend colonial legislation against night workers. And like in the Q&A, we'll come back to the history of legislation. In front of so many police stations at night, there sat a public very different from the party which is left, but also not that different. A random assemblage of night workers, night commuters, night workers, and night revelers, many of them femme-preventing. An assemblage marked by the state criminalization of various kinds of nocturnal sociality, another gathering of odd bedfellows, which traces the contours of another possible articulation of solidarity. The experience of the Red, the Black Maria, and the police station connects night workers with very different social positionality in an intimate degree of familiarity with the night watch state and its nationalist and cultural mechanism. And by night watch state here, I mean a spectral state that is largely absent in terms of provision of services and even the most basic duty of protection, but that is most intensely fed in its extractive and coercive functions, especially at night. It is a state whose legitimacy and everyday reproduction is deeply entangled with its capacity to prey on illegalized nocturnal urban space. What I want to mark here, however, is that a generalized condemnation of the night expressed in forms of temporal entrapment and enclosures is central to the operations for which United States routinely produces criminalized subjects, including queer subjects, whose practices of sustaining life rely on alternative insurgent temporal imaginations and operations of time. Nightlife thus in Lagos introduces queer temporalities insofar as it may function outside of or against hegemonic space time and its orientation towards productivity, but also insofar as it is tightly interwoven with illegalized or morally frowned upon forms of unproductive expenditure, pleasures, and practices, especially sexual practices. Paula used to provocatively assert, as soon as you turn off the lights, we are the straight people again, no one is straight again. As such, I'm thinking here of queerness not as defined as the sexualities or orientations of subject, but as a relationship to structure and norm, especially gender and sexual norm. And here I'm thinking a lot with Cathy Cohen scholarship. So I think of night workers as a gathering in front of police stations of odd bedfellows, night commuters, hooligans, area boys, queer revelers, sex workers, as one site of crystallization of hegemonic criminality discourses specific to Lagos, in ways that Cathy Cohen analyzed another set of figures united by relative degrees of ostracization in a different Black diasporic context, some of France, Woodson, and welfare free. The night as queer temporality is inextricable from a specific political economy which posits Blackness on the continent and elsewhere as the endpoint of imperial networks of accumulation and dispossession outside of normative parameters of laboral propriety and reproduction. Querying the possibility of life outside of or besides colonial and anti-Black terms of respectability or enlightenment, I see the insistence of night workers in inhabiting the night as a site of survival and life-making, as a sort of routine nocturnal sabotage in the sense Sarah Haley employs the term, quote, a practice of life, living, structural rupture, and imagined futures, unquote. The sites of refuge, rest, breath, nature, transgressive sociality, and otherwise inhabitation forged in the nocturnal economy are too precious to be renounced, in spite of the night watch state, its raids, checkpoints, Black Marias, and points. Thank you.
It's so grateful to be on this panel with such smart papers and folks that I've really adored from long ago and from more recently. So thank you for this invite, Olivia, Rose, and Mawr. And Celine, especially thank you for the hospitality and escorting them this morning, this afternoon to the hotel. I want to also just say thank you to a couple of folks I see in the room. Jazz and Jonathan are good people that I just want to shout out. I'll jump in. I'm reading from a paper that actually asks for Chrystel's feedback after being engaged with your work. So I hope the residents will show through. And I think there's so much already going on in terms of spatialization and violence, but also other possibilities through forcing through rules presentation. So towards a Black girl conference. And this will be very Philadelphia based. So I'm gonna not read names. I'm gonna just use letters. So which we could talk about in Q&A, the decision to strategically redeploy redaction and other forms of state-used non-disclosure, but for the purposes here of a kind of hopefully a kind of abolitionist project. So why was a defiant girl in a world where various figures of authority, including her parents and representatives of the state, sought to impose forms of spatial and social restriction aligned with mid-20th century visions of proper familial and urban governance? Although Y performed well in school, her parents, and especially her father Thomas, sought to restrict her extracurricular time to reproductive labor, aiding her mother in house chores and babysitting. Y, however, rejected the limitations placed on her for remaining in her parents' home, and she refused, beginning at ages 9 and 10, to engage in uncompensated labor assisting in reproducing her household. Y initiated defiance by running away from her parents to her grandmother Corinne's house, according to her mother June, with the encouragement of her grandmother. For Y, her grandmother's home represented a familiar space where she spent a few of her earlier years as her parents built their finances to purchase their home. Y found that returning to stay with her grandmother allowed her to live outside the pinch of acute want that defined the limits of her father's so-called family wage. With her grandmother, she had her own space, and her activities decentered care or concern for her younger siblings, allowing her to cultivate her desires for youthful becoming outside caretaking responsibility. Corinne was willing as well to spare enough sugar for her to experiment with baking pies for church functions. Corinne, her grandmother, also supported Y's intellectual and elocutionary precociousness, encouraging her to make public presentations at the Elks Temple, a Black social club, for which Y garnered name recognition in the Philadelphia Tribune. Y's willfulness and her rebelliousness grew worrisome for her parents, however, when she took money from her father's wallet in order to travel first to Wildwood in Atlantic City in New Jersey, and later in New York City, unaccompanied by an adult. Her father in particular was furious about her excursions and his tax on his limited wages. In response, he took her to the city's youth study center, the YSC, as you all know in Philly, euphemism for a child jail, turned into the state to help resolve what he considered his daughter's dangerous wanderlust and disobedience, and attempting to use one of the city's newly constructed, at this point, carceral facilities to discipline his daughter through a kind of scare-straight confinement. Although the YSC did not accept her as it was designed primarily for youth awaiting court dates, these actions nevertheless brought Y and her entire family under the scrutiny of the state through court-mandated social service appointments, which also forms the archive for this. As I engage Y's defiance as underwriting an alternative vision for the city from the vantage of Black femme youth under the repressive conditions of state surveillance rather than autonomous disclosure, I do not want to underestimate the power of her parents' fear for their daughter. The attempt to remand their daughter to the YSC is part of a complex response to the particular vulnerability facing young Black girls and femmes in the context of mid-20th century Philadelphia, given the available options open to working class Black families in the states and reformers' roles in channeling fears for children's safety through police jails, reformatory schools, prisons, and other processes and facilities, reproducing surveillance and containment. As available records from the late 1940s, which I'll come back to in a minute, of the Pennypack House, the notorious children's unit inside the city's adult jail, underscores the vulnerability, especially the sexual violence that the city's girls and especially its Black girls face. In the Pennypack House, the city processed young victims of sexual violence in addition to confining the girls that they also marked as delinquent, incorrigible, or as runaways. Y's family's attempts to discipline their daughter unfolded in a context in which a young Black femme or girl with no identifiable connections to a masculine or adult figure of protection in the street and in transit, and often under the authority of parents or other figures within their living spaces and homes, too often experience physical and emotional violation. Beyond an assessment of Y as naive, childish, or dangerously precocious, however, I engage her defiance as a determined criticism of the uneven, violent imposition of the breadwinner ideal over Black life and the broader spatial regulation expected of young Black girls and femmes as part of the rubrics of normality that garnered state power as city planning and urban reformism gained ascendancy in Philadelphia after the early 1940s. Y's actions to run away and to take money from her father's wallet drew to a head the contradictions and limitations of the modes of power and authority that consolidated within U.S. urban geographies in the mid-20th century from the advantage of a young Black girl. This imbues the category of racialized gender becoming with alternative registers and keys associated not with enclosure and violence, or not simply with enclosure and violence, but expressing horizons that stretch the limits of late industrial era Philadelphia's infrastructures. There is no longer evidence of what she envisioned for her trips to New York and into New Jersey. Perhaps she had heard radio commercials or elders talking about these places, and wanderlust drew her to see them for herself. Perhaps she went with the intent to escape her family in a more permanent sense, finding in these places a way, the idea of another life for herself. Maybe she enjoyed antagonizing her parents as a direct rejoinder to their insistence about her scheduled time at school and at home, primarily to do work caring for her younger siblings. More than any of these possibilities, the orientation and outlook of a Black femme youth contained only in archives produced because her plans were foiled and even perhaps unrecoverable for the person herself after her parents disciplined and reinforced by the state through social worker monitoring and the threat of jailing shifted her own perspective and outlook on what she had already attempted. Racialized gender under the freighted signifier of Black girlhood also carries radical potential for imagining different lines of flight and paths of desire beyond the city as compounding enclosure, in the fugitivity possible in the context of the expression of place through Black youth and femme movement and fugitivity. Across their quotidian existences, Black girls or femmes positioned like Y as Black elder daughter, quote unquote, were shuttled between expectations of providing augmentative labor to their mothers without direct access to money or control over their movement and social lives, a general vulnerability to sexual and physical harm, and a widening net of criminalization, surveillance, and incarceration encroaching on their entire families, often with them as the entry point, which co-articulated even from the 1940s with various formulations of policing, enhanced policing. Approaching this ideal on the part of her parents required wise labor of the breadwinner ideal, required wise labor, as it also contained her both through the unlivable wages paid to men like her father, but also by her father's state-sanctioned unilateral authority over the family's financial resources and spatial decision-making, and by the state's prerogative to keep tabs on her through mandated social worker sessions, a compounding domestic urban enclosure from her vantage. Y tugged at the limits of her family's adherence to this model, running away to the possibilities generated by her grandmother's care and authority, and later expropriating a portion of the limited family wage to engage in illicit travel and adventure. Through her refusal of the urban order, she also exposed the seams tying state and familial power through patriarchy, racism, and the social spatial organization of labor and reproduction. Critically, Black girls and femmes in mid-20th century Philadelphia challenged this nascent biopolitical ordering of the city from below, articulating the fleeting horizon of what Sarah Haley terms a Black girl commons. Writing about the context of the era of Jim Crow's transformation of Georgia in the 20th century, Haley underscores the Black girl commons as Black girls' negotiation of a treacherous anti-Black girl femme terrain, and as the quote traversal of the micro-penality of everyday life, queering and threatening the relations of household and property through sabotage and other modes, challenging a social geographic order containing them to highly circumscribed roles at best, and often exposing them to coercion, confinement, and sexual violence. For Haley, quote, sabotage is not about success or triumph against systemic violence and dispossession. Instead, it is about the practice of life living, disruption, rupture, and imagined futures. It is about the development of epistemologies of justice and collectivity, contestations of the binaries produced through Western juridical doctrine, and the individualizing ethos of criminal punishment, end quote. Sabotage in the broader essay names the acts of subversion unmaking the city as a gendered racial capitalist social factory, represented by the daily and eventful confrontation with the realities of these debilitating infrastructures of white domination, including city institutions, broadly working to police Black girls as part of a shifting regime of urban management, relying on the unmaking of Black social worlds through urban renewal, and employing its various modes of surveillance, including direct supervision and incarceration, in order to re-territorialize the city and in order to facilitate industrial and commercial accumulation through the production of absolute space generated in the raising of neighborhoods and communities, as well as the ongoing excess rent generated by racist rental markets and financial containment, included redlining within the zones of disaccumulation. Lord, that's a sentence. I underscore Black girls' geographic challenge to the configuration of the city as a social factory, which here refers to the integrated functions of the regime of urban accumulation across the geography produced through like factories and production, circulation and exchange, finance and banking, real estate development, the sites of consumption and social reproduction, configuring urban geographies of living, with an emphasis here on the centrality of places of incarceration and extended sites of surveillance, including the offices of social worker agencies within the formulation of what Ruthie Gilmore has termed the welfare warfare urban orders. From the vantage of Black femmes and Black youth in general, the mid-20th century creation of public infrastructures in Philadelphia, the extension and modernization first of earlier 1880s Beaux Arts redesign from Benjamin Franklin Parkway out, the consolidation of parks as green spaces for public use, the emphasis on compulsory public schooling, deemed a collective good and approximating a form of commons, coincided with the raising and concentration of their neighborhoods associated with urban renewal slum clearing efforts, the construction of facilities for incarceration in the heart of these same redeveloped districts, the further intrusion into their everyday lives by state or state-sanctioned officials serving the public, including the police, social workers, teachers, and other predominantly white and middle-class beneficiaries of this new order who gain materially and otherwise from the derision of Black life and confinement. Black girls in Philadelphia from the 1940s through the mid-1960s, which is the scope of this paper, often experienced the consolidation of the Keynesian Fordist urban spatial order and its recalibration of public space and territory through the rubrics of surveillance traversing the school, the row house, and the detention facility as enclosures defined by the exploitative and violent extraction of reproductive and sexual exploitation, enhanced surveillance and confinement. The primary infrastructure is guaranteeing white residents of the city of public or commons, patterned and codified modes of hypervisibility and radical invisibility that riddle the urban landscape with dangers and which have only grown with the post-1965 race to lock up Black urban life. As a collective, Black girls resisted their violent emplacement in the city, defined by confining housing infrastructures, endemic sexual violence, police yet unprotected neighborhoods, an often antagonistic school system, and the state's growing carceral apparatus justified through the mitigation of delinquency by charting a rogue phenomenology of the city. Black femmes collectively mobilized refusal in the face of the consolidation of the mid-20th century urban order. From the vantage of various powerful authorities in their lives, they misappropriated these infrastructures of inhabitation, articulated through refusal, often by way of physical absence. Philadelphia's mid-20th century Black girl commons depart significantly from the public and the commons associated with the idealized white nuclear family, and foremost, the male breadwinner and his reproduction. Refusal as the basis of a Black girl commons challenges the premise of normative theorizations of the commons as an affirmative right to access public infrastructures in the urban context, such as schools, parks, sidewalks, or streets. Their refusal exposed the core functions of state legal territorial creation of forms of white property and whiteness as property in place on its violent and negating edge, its anti-Black edge. Those marked by association with recent enslavement and migration for clearance and containment under urban renewal, the appropriation of public power, especially in the name of the public good, and a generic white commons associated with white property, by necessity required a dynamic of enclosure and segregation as an urbanized form of captivity for Black migrants within the reigning progressive and post-progressive eugenics-inflected social science and planning practices, which demarked and naturalized Black inhabitation as the anti-value in urban political economy. The Black girl commons undermines the integrity of public and commons as inherently good for all, underscoring the negating work of that state power consolidation in the context of the Keynesian Fordist era, induced through enclosure and the consolidation of federal state power. Attending to this history and disrupting the romanticization that often attends to the Keynesian order in the context of its succumbing to brutal neoliberalism, interrupts and challenges what might be understood as public or commons from the vantage of racialized gender and the particular experiences of Black girls marked as foils to the collectivities instantiated in white publics and commons. This is not a negation of the public or the commons as possessing conceptual and practical political potential as part of our claim so much to the city, so much as it is an analysis from the insurgent outsider position, which is the operative definition shared here of queerness. From the insurgent outsider position, which alongside accounting for indigenous unceded sovereignty troubled the facile linkages between public holding and a white supremacist settler state and the so-called liberatory potential of the common. In the first section of the larger essay, I contextualize the urban carceral enclosure that was essential to the metropolis's restructuring in the period between 1940 and 1960s, especially charting the rise and the support for the Youth Study Center here in Philadelphia. Next, I examine the efforts of critical Philadelphia-based Black sociologist Ira de Augustine Reed to counter some aspects of this criminalization, but that's messy, of Black youth, in particular about underscoring the relationship between so-called delinquency and the inadequacy of resources in the shifting political economy of labor and social reproduction, especially for working class Black communities. What's critical about Reed in this context is, though he sometimes does reproduce sort of the criminalization, he does also, he does push back against what at that point was being called pre-delinquents, the Glucks and others who pioneered this idea that children could be marked as pre-delinquents is emerging not in 1970 and 1940. So, but for today, I'm going to jump to the section that's the most interesting, than thinking about the sabotage, and trying to recover kind of Black girl comments through this practice. And then I want to actually end the talk today by trying to raise questions that might link this to questions of ecology. So Black girl fugitivity, refusal, and sabotage in the Keynesian Fortis social factory. In the census from the 1949 House of Detention records for youth, there's a 15-year-old girl with my same last name. I use the refracting and murky language of the passive voice because no information remains available about the surveyor who counted her among the many others who passed through the dank halls of the girls section of that facility during that particular month. At that time of the December census, this girl had already spent 21 days detained in the House of Detention. She is listed as a Baptist, this position there by order of the court, and marked as incorrigible. That is as incapable of being reformed. Incorrigibility is a state of subjectivity that freezes those who bore its imposition by judges, lawyers, and the state as beyond the realm of the correctable or the improvable. It noted an extremity in delinquency beyond recovery and successful reintegration. In the context of post-war dominant urban governance, with its primary goals of stability, growth, and containment, the demarcation of incorrigibility signified open, hostile refusal, but yet still kind of remaining so an often opaque unwillingness to engage in the orderly production and reproduction required of the political, economic, and social orderance of the immediate post-war city. Her incorrigibility brought her under the scrutiny of the law and kept her locked away for at least those 21 days in the Pennypack House inside the city's jail. Perhaps she hadn't anticipated or she simply refused to live by the rubrics of comportment prescribed by the state and proliferating through relations with caretakers or parents. A terrifying number of the other girls listed in the registrar's notes are listed for entering this same facility in order that investigators might conduct, quote, examinations for rape. This girl with my same last name was part of those who refused, perhaps, who used their bodies to interrupt violence or to become its protagonists rather than its characteristic and overdetermined victims in a world exacting for Black girls scrutiny and disposability, violence, and harm. I cannot recover her, but her incorrigibility, looking through the haze of time and the near opacity of a youth jail census, like the ledger before it, leaves open the possibility that she embraced the power of refusal in an age that could only envision progress through modernization and growth, but which continued to rely on the confounding combination of violent exclusion and socially sanctioned vulnerability, especially for Black youth. Along with her, there's at least 6 or 7 other young people during the same month, and over the course of years, dozens of others who are just marked as incorrigible. There are others who were held for mischief, for a breach of the peace. Beyond that, and the others, if we read the list of the incorrigible and the runaways, we find a whole little riotous mass, and of course I'm playing with Hartman here, or underground army of Black femme youth who refuse, even if their visions for a different order are structurally and otherwise unrecoverable. We know they refuse because they show up in the archive due in large measure to being exposed to punishment for their insolence. The state's construction of Black youthfulness or the legal status of the minor for Black people blurs with juvenile delinquency in this period of the 1940s and in these archives produced in the era of this federal city as the racialized delinquent came to serve as the inverse of the breadwinner in terms of a legal and social status. Black youth were marked through their relation to Black motherhood and the then information discourse of matriarchy, Black matriarchy and matriarchal organization, and its attended demographic analog, quote, female head of household associated within publications like a 1942 one, What Makes Johnny Bad, as well as the literatures of social scientists with Southern heritage and plantation origins, and which interpolated Black youth into the discursive realm of the pathological within mid-20th century governance. And it's critical, and I don't have to, maybe we could talk about this in Q&A, the ways that a certain kind of interwar description of Jews is grafted onto Black communities in this context, marginal man and all these other, through the Chicago school, right? Those people that Park and others who have German training, but then in the context of those kind of discourses in the context of German Jews and others weren't necessarily a pathological description, but the anti-Blackness of its translation as simply pathological is something we could talk about. The supposed sexual, social, geographic irregularity or queerness of Black life associated with non-normative social spatial arrangements inscribe Black youth, especially girls, as anti-children, as a specter of negative potential capable of unmaking the urban order through fundamental challenges to the eugenic futurity associated with post-progressive urbanism and the reconstruction of the city under the edicts of improvement, betterment, and reform. Black girls who were neither white nor boys, therefore not future breadwinners, nor wives because of the anti-Black matriarchal thesis, quote unquote, held to govern that the domestic spaces within the white nuclear family ideal experienced the city through radical, as I mentioned, radical invisibility and a vexing hypervisibility as the primary infrastructures of urban life failed to protect them and inflicted duress, injury, and harm, enclosing them within highly limited horizons. On Saturday, May 26, 1954, a 16-year-old girl, another Y will say, grew anxious and began pacing her parents' home restlessly. Earlier that week on Friday, school officials had phoned her mother, Elizabeth, to tell her mother of an intense visit that the girl had paid to the counselor's office, seeking her working papers. Seeking to mitigate what she perceived as the girl's growing anxiety, which she supposed in part stemmed from her intensive study and seriousness, and the seriousness with which she approached her education. Her mother, Elizabeth, suggested that Y invite a few friends over for a party with food and music in their family home. After the party ended, Y accompanied her uncle to drop off some of the other teenage girls who had come over for the festivities. As they were passing through Center City, Y jumped suddenly from the vehicle at a stoplight, quote, insisting that she would go into a club to hear a local band leader playing that was supposed to be playing in the vicinity. Although her uncle and her mother attempted to coax Y back into the car, she refused. Disturbed by their inability to control what they considered Y's erratic behavior, Elizabeth called the police to help her assist in regaining control over the girl's behavior. Far from calming the girl, however, the police arrested Y on charges of disorderly conduct and took her to the Youth Study Center, from which she was immediately sent to Monia Massing, however you say that, the prison, near 10th and Reed. Despite Y's otherwise stellar school record and a lack of previous contact with police investigated her, quote, episode as a, quote, possible narcotics addiction, ignoring their own physician's assessment. On the following day, police took Y to the city's medical examination facility at 27th and Arch for assessment. Although the examining physician suggested that Y had experienced a quote psychotic episode, there were no beds available at Philadelphia General Hospital, so Y was sent back to the Pennypack house. To our parents' great dismay, Yvonne spent nearly a week in that facility, a distressing experience for anybody, but especially considering the conditions of the facility in the 1950s and the reality that she most certainly did not receive assistance with the mental health issues that had prompted her mother to inaugurate this intervention by the police in the first place. Recognizing the potential further harm that the Pennypack house would likely inflict on Y, the family physician, the medical director of the city's Board of Education, and the physician who had done her original intake worked on her family's behalf to move her quickly from the Pennypack house to Philadelphia General Psych Ward. And what I'm getting at here, and try to draw more in the paper, is like that's a very class response. If you could call your family doctor to help you get out, you have a different relationship than many working class Black people in Philly at this point. Y remained institutionalized at the Philadelphia General Hospital for 10 more days after this initial arrest, or her initial transference. Documentation of Y's intake and interviews with city social workers suggest that school and the demands of her schooling, as well as the pressures of familial economic insecurity, were pressing her to work, but also hold down school and do all these things that erupted as a bout of what others could only describe as a psychic break, in which police sought to contain through discourses of narcotic abuse that were rising in that moment. Even after she was released, the idea that she would have to catch up with her schoolwork continued to be a source of deep anxiety, as the social worker notes remarked. The overall configuration of the school as a site of enclosure, even for the gifted middle-class Black student, produced anxiety and conditions not conducive for her overall well-being. Madness in this context names a complex social spatial relationship to order. While I'm not glorifying the deterioration of her mental status or mental health as simple or radical action, I am interested here in the ways that in the context of order, the eruption of something called madness orients an alternative schedule of becoming in extreme tension with the life schedule produced through schooling and reproductive labor, or labor, in her case, seeking a job to actually support her family. In early February 1956, manager of Woolworth's department store at 52nd Street and Market in West Philly observed A placed an 89-cent 4-pack of women's underwear under her coat. A was at the store with her elder sister B. The manager charged that B had orchestrated A shoplifting, though B denied. You gotta get this straight, right? B denied any prior knowledge of her younger sister's actions. The manager called the police, as well as B and A's mother, Grace. Since neither of the girls had ever faced trouble with the police, officials reprimanded charging either of them. Later, however, in October 1956, another store attendant caught B attempting to leave the store with $1.98 pair of boys' pants without paying for them. Grace had sent B apparently to price a coat that had caught their attention as they passed the store's windows, and hoped to purchase from the money she gave for the girls' coats, as well as a pair of pants for the young son. Attempting to help her cash-strapped mom, B took the pants and retained the full sum for them to give back to her mom for the coat and for to basically replenish the family's limited finances. While the first incident had led only to a reprimand, the second incident led police to arrest the 15-year-old, eventually requiring the girl and her family to attend regular sessions with a social worker, seeking on behalf of the city agency to, quote, adjust the girl, here a euphemism of surveillance, and if necessary, of violence subduing through arrest, that together acted to constrain what these officials deemed unreasonable or in other cases, psychotic enactments of defiance and sabotage. B, like many of the girls encaptured in this archive of city social worker notes, was a precocious young girl with a roving imagination about who she was and what she could be, living in a confining situation delimited by economic and social precarity facing Black communities in post-war Philadelphia. B had her own initiative, decided to attend William Penn School, which she thought would give her the opportunity to meet other children outside of her neighborhood in West Philadelphia, despite this distance from her home. In addition to her regular courses of study, Bee became actively involved in her school's drama department. The space of the stage and its potential for her becoming a self-directed life in a context in which Black girls often confronted force on the part of the state as well as within the intimacies of their own communities, captivated her attention. Twice she even after she's recorded and caught up with the social worker network, twice she absconded her scheduled appointments with the social worker to instead attend rehearsals that she considered more pertinent to her own life than the routine check-ins required by the court with social workers and their probing questions. The social worker's filing notes in B's case sought to indict her father for his lack of support for the family, as well as for substance abuse. These are the primary causes of the family's poverty. They called their own racialized scripts of patriarchal failure against the hesitance of Bee and her mother, and deriving it from the frustration. They used the frustration that Bee felt with her family situation to make the problem about her father. This is not to underplay Bee and her siblings' noted fear of their father, a man who had used abusive language and even physical violence toward them and their mother. As Bee noted to the social worker, her mother had broken down her fear of her husband by responding in kind with his threats and physical assaults. But even this had not withered the children's trepidation around a man who, according to Bee, drank and belted commands from his chair in their house. The father's despondency and abuse cannot be easily disentangled from the contradictions between socially sanctioned fatherhood in the idealized breadwinner nuclear form and the lack of remunerative work compounded by what was likely post-traumatic stress disorder suffered from his service during World War II. This is not to absolve him of the fear that he inspired, but is to draw out the compounding forms of economic and social violence directed that materialize the experiences of Black youth inside and outside of their households. To round out this talk, I want to say quickly that we must take care to underscore the actions of those who resisted in real time the consolidation of the forces that have precipitated what we now call the Great Acceleration, the speeding up of climactic transformation associated with the consolidation of the Keynesian Fordist political economy in the West. What happens if we view police and jails and prisons and the breadwinner ideal itself as among chief culprits in this transformation, helping to ideologically and materially underwrite fossil fuel accelerated use and containment politics, including the use of nuclear weaponry, that have all precipitated this set of crises currently euphemized as climate change or Anthropocene? What would it mean to take seriously the way that Black girls in films challenge the domains of labor and social reproduction in recognition of these two connected domains as the primary contact points between social formations and earthly metabolism, or Marxist so-called second nature? What would attending to the resistances and practices of place outside formal property in the law do to help us rethink the consolidation of earth-sundering regimes of capital, particularly as it drove this historical event now recognized as the Great Acceleration? How might such a robust theorization of resistances to environmental catastrophe outside direct contest over resource extraction in rural zones of extraction or urban production and pollution help us to reconsider the way forward outside the dangers of green enclosure that is constituting a new mixed energetic regime without actually interrupting the destructive carbon cycle or reducing oil or coal use? What could the emphasis on leisure, pleasure, absconding, and especially refusal and fugitivity add to our arsenal in thinking and moving away from the biopolitical necro-political nexus that's currently reconsolidating after the kind of Keynesian Fordist fall apart of the neoliberal era, but now in this kind of moment of green politics to save the planet? Thank you.
You all are, what I'm gonna say is like, you all are just so smart. Like, I've just been blown away from everything that you all have said today. Like, I just have notes of pages and I don't even know like where to actually start. But how this will go is like, I think I'll just start off with a question for you three, and then I'll turn to audience questions if there are some, and then I'll hand it over to Sydney, and then we'll just like bounce back and forth. But I was really invested in you all's kind of like bending of this normative understanding of queer beyond like a homosexual practice. And I just, and like, Chrystel, your mentioning of Kathy Cohen really like interested me because I like have like a model question that mentioned her anyways, but I was just wondering if you all could just more elaborate on this like notion of queer as like a politic or practice or even a way of being rather than kind of mere same-sex relations, and how your work now, previously or in the future, can expand notions of what we colloquially consider queer to be outside of like a Western nationalist paradigm. And essentially, how may you define Black queerness beyond like these like ciscentric homosexual practices that queer kind of gets demarcated to now?
Yeah.
So,
I think, yeah, I think Black feminists and Black queer studies folks and Black trans studies folks have really opened behind Cohen, have opened up, you know, the ways that queerness is a temporal and spatial glitch in a particular way. And that doesn't mean that it's always self-evidently or even unto itself a liberatory set of practices, but is one that challenges the kind of, you know, what you call straight time. But I think also we could think about it as the kind of straight geographies that are associated, especially in the Keynesian era with the breadwinner ideal. So thinking about, and I think that gets us, and I talk about this in the book Dark Agoras, that gets us to a complicated definition where Blackness and queerness in some ways are overlapping, but also compete for a certain kind of territory in terms of our conceptual territory, because they do, in some ways, they do both challenge temporal and spatial ordering. So it's not necessarily always sort of straightforwardly, you know, and outside. But I think what for me, what queerness adds to Blackness is a hesitance and a resistance to formulations, at least of mid-20th century Blackness, that also, while insurgent in context, we have now the hindsight to recognize the ways that they were also embedded in extractive violence. They were also embedded in a particular logic that rendered especially Black girls and Black youth vulnerable and Black women vulnerable. And we're watching it in real time where you know, where authorities of a certain credential of Black representation are the folks raising their hands for empire. So I think queerness challenges notions of Blackness that fit and slip easily into nationalist violence and reproduction. And I think it is, and I don't think it's a stable cluster of like a set identity. So therefore sometimes it does involve like non-normative sexual practices. And sometimes even those reproduce violence. So it's not, there's no stable kind of Blackness and queerness as a signified radicality, but it does open up it opens up those questions as ones to be answered. And I think I'll say this as well. It's its own form of spatialization. Like it's a counter spatialization to the hegemonic temporal and spatial ordering of urban space. That again, I think, while it can sometimes overlap with non-liberatory formations, it also does just query those normative, it queries the processes of the normalization.
Wow. I don't even know what to say after this, but I think there is a tension in trying to expand the ways in which we think about queerness, and a tension which I think is worth inhabiting. And so when I'm thinking about queerness with Cathy Cohen as politic, as relation to structure and pronoun, it's not necessarily to completely disengage from sexual practices and gender practices, because I think there's also seduction from like extirpating or like a kind of purge of the sexual and the kind of political respectability and just like defenses or like reactions that the a kind of like stubborn insistence into the sexual kind of provoke. So all that to say that at the same time as I don't want to leave the question of morality, the question of sexuality, I also think that there are ways of mobilizing a queer position to think about a kind of regulative desire from the state, but also from society for like a desire against certain forms of like promiscuity, certain forms of assemblages, and certain forms of coalitions. And in particular, in the context of thinking about queer organizing in Lagos, one of the questions that emerged during the NSAS protest is, so NSAS is those protests against this specific police unit, task force unit, that ended up being protests against policing in general, with from the segments of that organizing calls for abolition and an end to policing. And SARS targets all kinds of people, mostly low income, mostly women, queer people, sex workers, and everyone was talking about the very specific targets of SARS. But as soon as there was this call by Matthew that I mentioned in the talk about Queer Lives Matter and about the specific targeting of queer people, there was this kind of rejection and this kind of, especially from, there was just this kind of, there's this question of like the kind of particularism that queer as an identity is being associated with. At the same time as I do think that centering that particularism and that identity shed lights on the predicament that everyone else faces. And it's thinking about both grappling with particularity, but also thinking about particularism as a mechanism of separability and
No, it's a really great question that I'm still processing and thinking out loud. I mean, I think that question makes me want to think about a Black queer feminist intellectual genealogy, where Audre Lorde is not simply just a blueprint, but she's helping us to really excavate Black queer histories that are intentionally negated and erased, right? So part of why I really spend a lot of time with Tinsley as well to really think about queerness as a praxis of resistance is not to negate the importance and both the scholarship and activism around focusing on Black queer sexuality, which I deeply am invested in. I also think there's something about wanting to deeply understand that in order to understand the anti-Blackness of the world that we live in, right, to be Black and to be able to inhale and breathe is a queer act of resistance, right? And I think part of that is that even in that image of Garifuna New Yorkers, in all of their transnationalism and all of their transgenerationalism, right? And the queer aesthetics that they're performing, part of their embodied queerness is their indigenous Blackness, right? Is the disruption to normative understandings of even US Blackness, right? I'm kind of in this moment where I'm writing about the indigeneity of Blackness in the hemisphere, and I'm coming back to scholarship where African Americans in their political imaginary have a particularly deep connection to US Native American communities, right? So part of that desire within African American political thought for indigeneity is to also think about, well, what's the queerness of indigeneity within Blackness, right? And I think for me, the answers are in the queerness of that, right? So when you know, even in simply in that interview with Toni Morrison talking about Beloved, where she says that, you know, ancestors are always present. You just have to invite them to the table, right? For me, that I read that as a queer moment of understanding even the formulation of Black literary cultural expression, right? So I think there's a lot of power and capacity of thinking about queerness as a twofold project, right? It's not decentering sexuality and gender expressions, but also there's something about this normativity that's really has a chokehold on us, right? Yeah.
No, thank you all so, so much. I really love the different contexts in which you situated queer in, but also you all emphasizing it's not like a decentering of Black queer sexuality, but rather an expanding of queer kind of like not as just like an adjective, but just as like a verb or like way of being. So thank you all so much. Do we have any audience questions? If not, I have a lot more, but also Zoom questions. Okay, well, yeah, I'll ask another question. I want to ask a question actually, we'll start off with you, Prof. López Oral. I was really interested in kind of your challenging of Latinidad, and kind of like, how do you think your work interlinks or even like troubles this notion of like Latine or like Latinx, and like what does it mean to have Black, Indigenous, queer, and or Latine, Latinx all a part of one same subjectivity, but like also you mentioned kind of like a lot of those migrants coming from Central America that's like painted as a crisis now. Media is not depicting them as people of those racialized subjectivities, but what does it mean for those identities to be dislodged in media, politics, or discourse more broadly, especially thinking of like the populations that you yourself work with?
Yeah, that's a lovely question, right? Part of it is this, it's you know, I spend a lot of time today, and I normally spend a lot of time in these gatherings explaining particularly the long history of anti-Blackness in Central America, because part of what's happening intellectually with the project of Afro-Latinidad is that there's also a hegemonic project around Dominican Blackness being the kind of quintessential marker of Afro-Latinidad, right? As if the African diaspora isn't wider and broader, right? Right, so like, and that's an East Coast phenomenon, right? Like part of that has a lot to do with Afro-Latinx communities on the East Coast are immediately registered as Dominican, right? Because we also, in our national imaginary, don't think about Black Puerto Ricans, right? Arturo Alfonso Schomburg is recently being resurrected, right? And it's still, he's Puerto Rican, huh? Right? Like that kind of questioning and the wondering is still a perplexing question in 2024, right? So part of what I also do emphasize is that they've also been centuries-long Black Latin American communities that are both affirmingly and both politically consciously Black, right? So these are communities that did not attend university to understand that they're Black, right? And part of, and I'm not saying that in a funny haha way, part of the political activism behind Afro-Latinidad is that most Latinx folks take hopefully a Latinx studies intro course and realize, oh yeah, the African diaspora was actually 10 times bigger in this part of Latin America and all parts of Latin America, right? So part of that is trying to really disrupt. I mean, Garifuna folks reject Afro-Latinidad, right? I'm also someone who's really critical about what the term is doing. The Latinx thing is more of a gender queer expression of more recent undergrad and grad activism on campuses. But the term is also in response to Hispanic, which is a US government construction for Spanish-speaking people. It's a census term. It's literally an empty, like, what? What is that? Like, you know, it's an empty signifier that doesn't have much, for me, a lot of understandings of the racializations of Latinx people in this country. So yeah, it's a big question that I'm constantly trying to push. I'm also really trying, you know, part of how I'm writing around Afro-Latinidad is from Black studies. And part of that is like, there is a particular centering around Blackness as a political project of consciousness that isn't really, I often wonder, how do we get from a region that had the largest, right, freed and enslaved African population to a region that is so racially mixed that they come to the US and there's like, oh, I don't know what to check off. And, Latinidad is not a race, right? It's an ethnic marker, right? But in this country, the majority of mestizo Latinxs, the J-Los, the Sofia Vergaras, they want it as a category, right? They want it as a political category that is deracialized from its history. Right? So.
Thank you so much. Yes,
I have a
Rosie?
question for Dr. Roane. When you mentioned at the beginning, your choice for redacting the names of the young girls and femmes I guess, and how that's part of possibly like an abolitionist politics as well. I was wondering if you could talk more about that decision.
Yeah, so I started this in Dark Auroras in the chapter on the 1964 riot, North Philly riot. In part because I think it is in part to like interrupt my own historical training, which would suggest then someone's name, you go do all this research to try to figure out who they really are. You use the census, you use all this other kind of data to inhabit who they were, to make them, to blow this kind of life into them, which of course, number one, is already a kind of violent process. We could talk about, all the kinds of layers of, with Trujillo and others about how archives are, and our act of extracting from them is its own sort of violence. But I think in the space of the riot chapter, it was literally like, some of these people are probably still alive, as are some of these people who show up as young girls and femmes in this project. In the riot chapter, some of the people I exposed their names because they had direct confrontations with journalists and others, and they said, and one of them in particular, Odessa Bradford, who was credited or discredited with starting the 64 riot, word refusal when police attempt to arrest her and fighting back. She embodied this when she gave an interview to the Tribune. She was present before the camera, but she also wore these dark glasses that suggested, like, one, I'm looking at you and I'm pushing back against this narrative that it was just like domestic strife. The real issue was the police beat me up. Like, let's be serious. Let's not put it on anything else. But also just, again, this maintenance of like, I'm not fully transparent to you. And I think I engaged that with Sharp and her dyad of redaction and annotation, but also just, more broadly with Gleason and others to think about how opacity can be powerful. And I grafted that onto this, and I don't think it directly fits in the same way as it did in the riot chapter, all of that nuance around her embodiment, her embodied presence, but refusal. But I did see something in their acts of refusal that wanted me to do a similar thing. One is also semi-protective. It's not that you couldn't go find all these records. They're in a public archive. They've already been exposed. They're ongoingly exposed for anyone who goes to that space and looks at them. So it's not like I'm hiding fully their information, but also like the PPD is a petty organization, and knowing what they might do, I couldn't be fully accountable for all of what they might do, and it may not make any sense to anybody but them, right? I don't know why they, what it might inspire in them. So I back away from fully presenting these folks' names. But also I think that it takes away that historical impulse to like go look for these people in their totality, but to take them in this snapshot of when they are subdued, when they are arrested, as a point of departure for piecing together a spatial practice that I'm calling the Black Girl Commons. Again, it doesn't fully answer. Let me say also, I think redaction is a state power, like especially in the U.S. context, but also Western quote unquote democracies. Redaction is often used as a way to maintain putative transparency while also not maintaining that transparency at all and actively obscuring who did what, and especially on the side of agents of the state are often redacted out of FBI records or other records to protect state power. So it's a redeployment of that power And one that doesn't, I don't think it's fully resolved, but that's some of, we could talk more about it, but that's some of why I approach this in that way, to not further expose people to be accountable to what PPD might do, but also to think about their social and geographic practices outside of something that might make it feel definitive, like a biography.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Sunny.
I had a question for you, Chrystel. I was really intrigued by the concept of, you didn't use the word pseudo-domesticity, so did you use the word alternative domesticity?
Proxy homes.
Proxy homes, okay, I was like, there's something along there. And that was like something that was really interesting to me, especially thinking about like queer nightlife. And I used to live in St. Louis for a long time, and there's kind of like just this one strip that like all the queer bars and coffee shops were at. And I worked at a cafe there, and so we would all like go to the bar afterwards. And so it was also, St. Louis is a very small city, so you recognize the same places, like you know one person, you know 10 other people. But Lagos, like I'm imagining Lagos to be like a much bigger city, right, where it might be easier to become more anonymous. And so I think like where my mind was going as you were talking was, I was like names of bars like popped into my head from that street, and I was like, oh, I know like 5 people who would be like, if you were looking for so and so on like a Thursday night, they were probably at this or this place, right? Or like if you're like, oh, I haven't seen so and so in a while, it would be like, oh, they haven't been at this spot, right? St. Louis is very small. So I was just like wonder in the context of like proxy homes, like that type of like familial space. Because you also mentioned how like there were some spaces where it's just a ton of people in the room. So yeah, I guess would just love to hear more about that and like the contours of Lagos.
Yeah, thank you. I love that question, especially because I think that's one of the things I did not really get to articulate in that paper, but that like thinking about nightlife, and there are ways in which people do scholarship on nightlife. It's oftentimes this kind of very specific temporality, like looking at people who go out like on Friday night, or Saturday night, like very specific times of the week, and this kind of like extraordinary moment or temporality. And thinking about proxy homes, it was really about thinking about nighttime as part of a more like routine experience, something we do even like during weeknights, like on a Monday night, like what does a space looks like? What kind of publics what does it mean to be able to also like trace and like plot your life and your sense of time across night span into those proxy homes. And one characteristics of Lagos is that I'm trying to think also about denaturalize what it means to be what night means, and how the night also produces a very different spatial sense of navigating the city. And you have this phenomenon of like gates emerging. Like it depends on neighborhood to neighborhoods, but around like 7 or 8 p.m. You have all those like residential streets that become gated, and it becomes really complicated to navigate. Like you have very like narrow and restricted sense of space at night compared to like the freedom, especially even on a car. Like you wouldn't be able to enter a lot of streets outside of your specific neighborhood or the specific workplace. So it means that the geography of the night of those kind of nocturnal occupation is also very consolidated in very specific environments where you know the people that you're going to find at those bars. There is the sense, even if Lagos is huge, there is the sense of like intimate sociality. And even I would say what is very kind of disturbing to think about the role of those sites in terms of a sense of self is the fact that a lot of people you might not be able to trace in other ways, as like via like a specific address or a specific workplace, or even like a phone number, might be able to be traced via those sites of nocturnal entertainment. Being able to like reconnect with someone because you know that they're going to be like on a Monday night at that specific club or that specific bar. Where nightlife becomes a kind of site for a sense of continuity in a context of various uncertainties.
So, yeah, thank you so much. The person in the sweater had a question, and then you.
Yeah, this question's for Dr. Roane. I was thinking about how you were talking about land, land not being the only source of ancestral connection and veneration. You bringing up Toni Morrison and her interview on Beloved and how land could foreclose the idea of Black people as indigenous. And I wanted you like to talk more about the tension between Blackness in Central America, Blackness being ascribed to the Caribbean coast, and how the tension or maybe the disconnection between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic in that formulation of Blackness, as you're talking about Blackness being folklorized rather than politicized. And then thinking about, you talked about and Jackie Alexander and the crossings of how the water as memory, and bringing memory into the ocean and the water, right? And even with the image that you started off in the presentation, those things are very present. And thinking about also back to M. Jackie Alexander in the chapter 7 of the Sacred, like specifically the naming of place being somewhat misleading. I'm quoting it, but like the naming of place and carrying off of geography as the spirit being cordoned off to a certain area, a certain geography. Like how is that shaping Blackness in your study or what you're seeing in those communities?
I appreciate the question. And I appreciate bringing M. Jackie Alexander and the sacred into this conversation, particularly because part of that image is that it is an image of an ancestral remembrance. And it's a degug, right? So it's a ceremony for the ancestors, to bring the ancestor into the space. One thing that I'm thinking about through the public performance of Garífunanes in New York City is how this embodied archive that's in the flesh, right? That's in an embodied performance, right? How does that ancestral memory that is transmitted through dance and spiritual possession articulate it, right? And part of that articulation is also land making in a way that doesn't make land the anchor. So part of what's really captivating about that image is that that image has nothing to do with Central America's Caribbean coast, right? And it's how Garifuna folks are bringing their ancestral land into that space is through the public performances of Garifuna sacredness, right? And I also struggle in having how much do I disclose about that sacredness, right? And protect the sacredness of that archive, right? Because part of the rituals is that, and part of the gender politics is Garifuna women are the only ones that have access to ancestral knowledge. The men are the only ones in the space conjuring the ancestors through drumming, right? So part of that epistemology of Garifuna sacredness is also deeply understanding that women are not simply matrilineal formulations of gender labor divisions, but are also are the bedrock. We don't have ancestors without Garifuna women, right? And I think that's incredibly, like I have to take a deep breath, right? Like that's a lot of labor, right? That's a lot of generational labor, right? But that's also kind of the way of being, right? The way of being Garifuna. And in Central America, the particular emphasis that I'm putting on how Blackness is ascribed to be from elsewhere is that one of the ways that Central American mestizaje, the racial project itself, understands its anti-Blackness is to mark Blackness as foreign to the national project, right? So part of this archive of if the nation state is in formation after the arrival of Black folk, then Black folks weren't part of the formation, right? That's an intentional erasure that is throughout Central America's Caribbean coast, right? And I would say Belize and Panama are probably the primary examples of Central American nation states, and particularly their Black communities in resistance to that archive, right? Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Answers my question.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, are there any questions on Zoom? There's one you said?
Oh, no, I said we probably have time for one more question.
Okay. I have a question that can like round this out, but I wanted to make sure nobody else had a. Okay. This is gonna be like a big question, to kind of like combine a few themes, but basically, I want you all's opinions on kind of where Black studies overall and Black queer studies is going, but in particular vantage points of your research. So for you, Professor Roane, kind of like in your reading against or along specific archives as you were trained as a traditional historian, and like also just like knowledge on like being in Philly now and doing research on Philadelphia, I would like love to hear. For you, Chrystel, how is it to do Black queer research as an ethnographer on the continent itself, and just kind of like where you see Black studies going, and like is it as, I guess, welcoming or not welcoming, or I guess like supportive to queer Black studies on the continent, and then for you, Professor López Oro, just kind of like your thoughts about kind of mestizaje, and you said that you are approaching Latinx studies through a Black studies lens, so kind of like what does that mean for like Black studies going forward? Yeah, so that was a lot, but I hope that like that made sense.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think for me, which is why I ended with the environmental ecological crisis and trying to somewhat awkwardly bring that in at the end. I think we're at a place where all of our, from my vantage as someone who does Black ecologies and Black geographies, where we face a existential crisis to Black life, to all life, and in the planetary sense. And so I think bringing questions of urban history, Black urban history that have been isolated from those questions back to those questions. I think Black queer studies, for example, is the primary site of theorizing in productive and generative and counter-hegemonic ways, something like social reproduction. But that's never, though we know social reproduction and labor are the two main hotspots where human activity face up to, earthly metabolism, those are isolated away from it as a kind of sequestered, and not having anything to say about ecology. So I think that's part of it for me. I think it's also quite interesting. I'm a trained historian and I'm up here trying to theorize space. You're a trained geographer and you're trying to theorize time. And I think that's it. One thing that's something about our like the limits of our disciplinary homes and the work to just constantly to remake them. I also see this panel as like the future of the kinds of work that needs to happen, both in terms of, not transnational practices that isolate or that, I guess, deprovincialize the ways that we engage these questions and bring them into conversation across the diaspora. So I see this kind of panel as the future of Black and Black queer studies.
Thank you.
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
Especially because I don't know who is on Zoom and my paranoia is like up there. So don't quote me on anything I'm about to say, but like hearing myself being referred to as an anthropologist is like kind of jarring. And I think of myself, so my department at home is a Black studies department.
Right.
But I do mobilize ethnography as a mode of inquiry and also archives and like so many other things, which does speak to like Black studies as this non-disciplinary formation. And the kind of tension that emerge of like trying also like to fit Black studies within specific disciplinary frames. But where I see my work, like the ways in which I think about where my work is situated in Black studies in relation to other kinds of work, is thinking about a project, like thinking about Black studies. And the reason why I'm not thinking of myself, for instance, as someone who does African studies, is thinking about Black studies as a political project. And having a deep distrust of African studies, area studies, ethnic studies, and sometimes a certain corners of Black studies, for which it's not necessarily about formulating a political project, but it is about this project of description, which does not undo what the project of social sciences as an anti-Black project was. And it's kind of like, and the reason why it is a project of description, especially outside of the US, I'm thinking about the ways in which the conversation about queerness or about Blackness is always about creating those kind of like testaments of existence. Black people, like people are also thinking about Blackness there. Queer people exist on the African continent. Those kind of like depiction, this question of description and proof of existence, I think fits within the disciplines as a kind of like neoliberal diversity projects of calling upon a nation state or calling upon a specific political collectivity to make a case for rights, case for inclusion, for recognition, that goes with, in my mind, a certain kind of neoliberal inclination and domestication of what those identities actually mean. So I'm thinking here with Vincent about the idea that the West is a project, not a place. And I think that's really what underground my work, and about Lagos as one afterlife of that project, what it means to think about the desire to be white, the desire to be the master. Thinking about anti-Blackness as this imperial global force. And so it means thinking about empire as a scale and not about nation states. And when you don't think about nation states, it also eliminates questions which are frankly stupid, as what does it mean to be Black in a Black Mediterranean nation state? Like, yeah, why? But yeah, I think that's where I am at the moment, thinking about the work we do, not as proving existence, but as actually transforming our lives.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question. Keisha Khan Perry, right? She is right here in this gorgeous apartment. That is your answer to how do you do Black studies from within Latinx studies. I mean, part of the tricky thing, right? And I think it's both a field training, but it's also institutional training, right? We both come out of UT Austin's Black Studies department, right? Professor Perry comes out of anthropology's African diaspora program. That department basically creates Black studies at UT, right? Ted Gordon, Joao Costa Vargas. So all of these Black anthropologists really gave me the language to think about the questions of Blackness within Latinx studies in a way that disrupts their kind of really complicated conundrum around race. So Latinx studies has a really big problem with race. They don't know how to do it, right? And they don't know how to do it because part of the project of Mestizaje, it didn't only happen in Latin America, right? It extended, right? So Julia Hooker's work, her second book, Theorizing in the Americas, right? Where she puts Sarmientos in conversation with Vasconcelos in conversation with Douglas. Like has been a hemispheric conversation around political and intellectual elites, but Latinx studies is a project, it's a neoliberal area studies that really is responding to the values, the really ironic values of the American dream. It's a field that's really about, hey, here's this visibility, right? The three Hispanic groups, right? Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans, right? So thinking about that kind of institutional history, and it's not to knock it, right? But it's also to complicate how they're dealing with race, right? Because part of the questions, I mean, I would never be able to land in Latinx studies, both as as a thinker, as a writer, as a living and breathing person, right? Because my entire being and existence is a disruption to that field, right? And particularly Blackness can't be simply an add-on to this project of Latinidad, right? Latinidad doesn't happen without Black and Indigenous peoples. So Latinx Studies tries really hard to not really emphasize on that.
Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna invite Cindy up to close us.
Yeah.
So thank you, Mark, for facilitating this wonderful Q&A. It's always just like such a treat to be able to come together and be curious together, just take time out to like think in community. So those of us on the Colloquium committee were brainstorming potential themes for this year. We kept coming back to this idea of Black queer world making. We wanted to bring together a conversation about all the layers and what it means to be a Black queer person in the world. And we wanted to draw together from a broad array of geographic, theoretical, and methodological positions and locations. Our panelists and our conversations today exemplify the range of intellectual possibilities in the field of Africana Studies. I'd like to once again thank my fellow committee members, Rosie, Olivia, and Mark for making the Miss Audra, Miss Carol, who are on the Zoom, and Tyrone for all the necessary logistical work. The department would be lost without you all. And of course, I speak for all of us and warmly thanking our panelists for offering their brilliance and thoughtfulness today. Dr. López Oro, Dr. Roane, Chrystel, Oloukoï, thank you so much. Thank you for everybody who's joined us on Zoom. We appreciate the internet community. And with that, that will conclude our 11th annual Graduate Student Colloquium, Black Queer Placemaking Method, Histories, and Diasporas. Thank you all so much for coming out today. There is still some snacks in the room next door, so go for it.